The cabin. My wife Amanda and I have a tradition of taking yearly vacations to different places, a way to break from the monotony of city life and enjoy some quiet, uninterrupted time together. This year, we opted for something more secluded than usual, an isolated cabin nestled in the dense forests of northern Minnesota. It was described online as being a peaceful retreat, far from civilization, tucked between towering trees and rolling hills. It sounded perfect, especially since we were craving a break from the constant hustle of the city. After flying into Duluth, we grabbed a few groceries at a small store in town, enough to last the 3 days we'd be there. We didn't rent a car, since we didn't plan on leaving the cabin once we arrived. If we needed anything, we figured we could always call for an Uber. Our taxi driver was a friendly, older man who chatted with us as he drove, pointing out landmarks along the way. The ride was peaceful, the road winding between endless stretches of pine trees and jagged rock formations. By the time we arrived, it was just after 7 p.m. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the forest. The cabin stood alone, surrounded by dense trees on all sides. The driveway was little more than a set of tire tracks in the dirt. It was the kind of place that would make for an ideal retreat from the world, completely cut off from everything. We thanked the driver and paid him, then stepped out into the cool, crisp air. The cabin was small but charming, with a rustic wooden exterior and a stone chimney that hinted at a cozy fireplace inside. We unloaded our groceries and bags and made our way into the cabin. Inside, it was simple: a main floor with a small kitchen and living room, and a loft above, accessible by a ladder where the bed was. The loft was snug, with a low ceiling that forced you to crawl into bed, a cozy feature we found endearing. We unpacked the groceries and made a quick dinner, still tired from the flight and the long drive. After eating, we lit a fire in the hearth and opened a bottle of wine. The flickering flames cast a warm glow over the cabin as we settled in for the night. Everything felt perfect. The silence of the forest was a welcome contrast to the constant noise of the city. It was around 11 p.m. when we heard it, footsteps outside. At first, I thought I had imagined it, but Amanda's wide eyes told me she heard it too. Someone was walking just outside the cabin, the sound of their steps unmistakable on the soft ground. They were close, too close. Trying to keep calm, I told Amanda not to worry. I got up and peered out the window, expecting to see nothing but darkness. But as I looked out, it hit me just how dark it had gotten. The trees seemed to form an impenetrable wall around the cabin, the night sky hidden entirely behind their thick branches. "I don't see anything," I whispered to Amanda, but my heart was pounding. I walked over to the door, hesitating for a moment before stepping outside onto the small porch. I flicked on the outdoor lights, illuminating a small patch of the driveway and the edge of the forest. But there was no one. The night was eerily still, the only sound the faint crackle of the fire inside. "Maybe it was just an animal," I said, more to reassure myself than Amanda. But as I turned to go back inside, I realized the footsteps had stopped. They hadn't faded into the distance, they had simply stopped. I went back inside, locking the door behind me. Amanda was still sitting on the couch, her face pale. "I think it came from behind the cabin," she whispered. A chill ran through me. The forest wrapped around the cabin like a blanket, dense and full of shadows. Whoever, or whatever, it was, could easily be hiding just out of sight. Trying to stay calm, I told Amanda to head up to the loft and stay quiet while I checked the windows again. I did a quick sweep of the small cabin, but there was nothing, no sign of anyone. As I stood by the front door, debating whether to go back outside, a sudden, loud thump echoed through the cabin. It came from above. Amanda looked up at the ceiling, her face filled with fear. Someone, or something, was on the roof. I froze, my mind racing. The footsteps started again, slow and deliberate, moving across the roof. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, trying to keep my voice steady as I explained our location. The dispatcher told me to stay inside, and that police were on their way, but it would take them some time to reach us, given how remote the cabin was. For the next hour, Amanda and I sat in silence, barely breathing, as we listened to the steady thud of footsteps above us. Whoever was up there wasn't in a hurry. They seemed to be waiting for something. Every now and then, the steps would stop, only to start again a few minutes later. It was as if they were pacing back and forth, deliberately trying to unnerve us. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we heard the sound of boots hitting the ground outside, followed by the crunch of footsteps moving away from the cabin. I peeked out the window, catching a glimpse of a shadowy figure disappearing into the forest. When the police arrived, they took our statements and searched the area, but there was no sign of the person. They couldn't explain why someone would be out there, miles from the nearest town, in the middle of the night. The idea that they might have been waiting for us to go to sleep, or worse, to step outside, was horrifying. We didn't stay for the rest of our vacation. The police gave us a ride back to town, where we checked into a hotel for the remainder of our trip. Even now, the thought of that night sends chills down my spine. Whoever was out there, lurking in the darkness, had a reason for being there. We're just thankful we left before we found out what it was. The perfect stranger. I've lived in the same house for 8 years. It's a standard, family-sized home, which made sense when I had roommates. But after they moved out, it was just me living there, and suddenly, all that space felt unnecessary. Technically, it's a 4-bedroom house, but I only use 2 rooms, the master bedroom where I sleep and the smaller room I turned into a gaming den. The other 2 rooms are on the far end of the upstairs hallway, one filled with old storage boxes and the other completely empty. After a long shift at work, I got off at 9 p.m., stopped at Wendy's to grab dinner, and went straight home. Tomorrow was my day off, and I had big plans to do nothing but game all night. I settled into my chair, slipped on my headset, and fired up Call of Duty. Before I could even load into a match, I thought I heard a knock at the front door. I paused the game, pulled off my headset, and listened. Silence. If someone had knocked, they would have knocked again, right? Figuring I was just hearing things, I shrugged it off and jumped back into my game. 2 hours flew by. Then I heard it again, another faint noise, like a knock or maybe a door closing. This time, I took off my headset and sat still, straining my ears. With my door closed and the sound muffled, it was hard to tell exactly what it was. Something about it made me uneasy, though. I stood up and crept out into the hallway, I'm not waiting to hear the noise again. But after a few minutes of listening, there was nothing but the sound of my own breathing. I decided to head downstairs to check things out. When I opened the front door and peered outside, the street was empty. There was no sign of anyone nearby. I double-checked that the front door was locked and went back upstairs, leaving my game room door open this time, hoping that if the sound came again, I might hear it more clearly. I returned to gaming, trying to shake the uneasy feeling that had settled over me. About 20 minutes passed, and just as I finished a round, I leaned back in my chair to stretch. That's when I saw it, a figure, moving quickly past the open doorway. I froze. My heart raced, and I ripped off my headphones, staring at the empty hallway beyond the door. Someone, or something, had just moved past the doorway, but it was gone before I could get a good look. My pulse thundered in my ears, and I sat there for what felt like an eternity, paralyzed by fear. After several minutes, I finally found the courage to get up. I stepped cautiously into the hallway, looking left and right. Nothing. Slowly, I moved through the house, checking every corner. No sign of anyone. But when I reached the front door, my stomach dropped. It was unlocked. I was certain I had locked it when I came back upstairs. I grabbed my phone and called the police, trying to explain the situation as calmly as I could. I wasn't sure what had happened, whether someone had been inside or if my mind was playing tricks on me. But the sight of that figure and the unlocked door had shaken me to my core. The police arrived about 20 minutes later and searched the house thoroughly. They checked every room, every closet, and every corner of the house. At first, they didn't find anything. But then, one of the officers opened the door to the empty room at the end of the hall. Inside, they found signs that someone had been living there. There was an old sleeping bag stuffed into the corner, along with a few empty food containers, bottles of water, and even some tattered clothes. My blood ran cold. I hadn't been inside that room in months. The officer looked at me with a grim expression and explained that it was likely someone had been living in my house without me knowing, hiding in that unused room. The figure I'd seen must have been that person, sneaking through the house and possibly watching me for who knows how long. I stood there in shock as the police took notes and asked questions. How long had this person been there? How had I not noticed? The thought that a stranger had been living just on the other side of the wall from me, watching me while I went about my life, was beyond terrifying. The police advised me to stay somewhere else for the night while they conducted a more thorough investigation, but nothing ever came of it. Whoever had been there had slipped away without a trace, leaving only the haunting thought that they had been there, quietly coexisting in my home for who knows how long. And every time I remember this or think about this, I am scared to my bones, thinking about the possible consequences that might have resulted. I really thank my lucky stars that I did not come out worse for wear under the prevailing circumstances. Even now, months later, I can't shake the feeling that someone is watching me. Every creak of the house, every rustle of wind outside makes my heart race, reminding me of that night. I've since installed new locks, security cameras, and motion sensors throughout the house, but the unease remains. The reason being how much advanced technology you might deploy, a determined psychotic intruder can find ways to harm you if he or she really is intent on completing the nefarious mission they embark upon. I often wonder how long that person had been there, living unnoticed just down the hall. The thought of what might have happened if I had confronted them fills me with dread. There's no telling what they would have done. All I can do now is make sure that no one else ever sneaks into my life unnoticed again. The scariest part is that I'll never know. The hellacious road trip. The road trip from Portland to Chicago was something I had been looking forward to for a while. Nearly a 3-day drive, I'd made sure to plan ahead by booking Airbnbs along the way. The whole idea of staying in a cozy, out-of-the-way places appealed to me more than crowded hotels. My first stop was in Wyoming. That part of the state doesn't have many big cities, and as I got closer, I realized I'd be staying in one of the smallest towns I'd ever seen. I was quite thrilled at this prospect. After crossing into Wyoming, the weather quickly turned. Heavy snow began falling, coating the highways in thick white powder and slowing my progress. By the time I finally rolled into town, the sun had set, and the place looked deserted. I hadn't expected much, but it was quieter and darker than I'd imagined. I hadn't even seen a gas station or fast food joint, let alone anything that looked like it would serve food. My stomach growled, reminding me that I hadn't eaten in hours, but with no restaurants in sight, I resigned myself to eating the snacks I'd packed. To be honest, the atmosphere was quite eerie and foreboding, and it kind of dampened the ravenous appetite that I had worked up. The road to the Airbnb was long, stretching out from the main part of the tiny town into a snow-covered field lined with towering pine trees. The house, a small cabin tucked between the trees, looked quaint but isolated. I pulled up along the side of the house, parked, and grabbed my bag. The snow crunched beneath my boots as I made my way to the front door. The driveway, illuminated only by the headlights of my car, felt eerie in the dark, but I was glad to finally be inside when I punched in the code to unlock the door. I loved the warmth of the room after driving through a very cold weather for most of the part of my journey. The place was small, about 500 square feet, just as the listing had said. An open living room connected to a bedroom and a tiny bathroom. It felt cozy, and after a long day of driving, I was eager to relax. I tossed my bag next to the bed, kicked off my boots, and settled onto the couch. But just as I was getting comfortable, a loud thump came from the bedroom. My heart skipped a beat, and I turned around, staring at the door I had just come through. At first, I thought maybe something had fallen. I got up, walked back into the bedroom, and turned on the light, but everything looked the same as when I had dropped off my bag. I checked the bathroom and glanced around the small space but found nothing unusual. The only thing that caught my attention was the closet door. It was a simple wooden door, and when I reached for the handle, it didn't budge. It was locked. I found it odd that an Airbnb would have a locked closet, but I brushed it off, figuring the owner was storing personal or cleaning supplies inside. Satisfied that everything was fine, I went back to the living room and sat on the couch, trying to relax. But something about that thump stuck with me. My mind raced, running through all the possibilities of what could have caused it, but I tried to push it away. 15 minutes later, I got up to check the weather. Pulling aside the curtain, I peered out into the night. Snow was still falling heavily, and the driveway was already covered again. The tall trees cast long shadows across the field, and the darkness beyond the porch light felt endless. I pulled the curtain shut and turned back to the couch, but just as I did, I saw something move in the bedroom out of the corner of my eye. I froze, my heart pounding. The movement had been slow and deliberate, like the shadow of a door opening. I stood still for a moment, then crept toward the bedroom doorway, straining to hear anything unusual. But when I entered, the room was still. The bed, the bathroom door, everything was in place, except for that closet door. The unsettling feeling from earlier returned, stronger now. I walked over to the closet and hesitated for a moment before grabbing the handle. To my surprise, it turned easily, and the door swung open. The closet wasn't locked anymore, but inside, it was completely empty, a small walk-in closet with nothing but bare walls. Confused, I took a step back, trying to piece together what I had seen and heard. Just as I turned around, a noise came from behind me. I spun around, and there, standing in the bathroom doorway, was a man. He was large, maybe 6 feet tall, and he looked exhausted. His face was scratched, his clothes dirty, and his eyes hollow. For a moment, we just stared at each other. He didn't seem startled by my presence, nor did he show any signs of aggression. Instead, he calmly knelt down next to the bed, reaching under it to pull out a large, worn duffel bag. The man stood up, slung the bag over his shoulder, and without saying a word, walked right past me and out the front door. I rushed to the window, watching as he trudged through the snow, his figure disappearing into the darkness beyond the pine trees. My mind was racing. Who was he? What had he been doing in the house? I grabbed my phone and called the police, explaining everything I'd seen. After they arrived, the officers took down my description of the man and searched the cabin, but there was no sign of him. The closet was empty, and aside from the duffel bag's absence, nothing seemed out of place. The Airbnb host was contacted, but even they seemed at a loss for an explanation. I left town the next morning, still rattled by what had happened. The more I thought about it, the more unsettling it became. The man hadn't been just sleeping there. He had been hiding. He had been in that closet when I arrived, waiting. If I had gone to bed just a little earlier, or if I hadn't checked the closet, I might have woken up with him still inches away from me. To this day, I can't shake the feeling of dread when I think about that night. Who was he, and what was he doing in that remote Airbnb? I'll never know for sure, but I'm just grateful I didn't find out the hard way. The ending could have been a sad and tragic one for me if things had not turned out the way they did at the end. The stranger. It had been a long week of meetings and emails, so when a client requested a face-to-face in a small town called Ravenwood, I figured it would be a nice change of pace. I booked an Airbnb several weeks in advance, a quaint, single-story house tucked away in a quiet neighborhood. The plan was simple: drive the 3 hours, stay the night, meet the client in the morning, and then head back home. I didn't think much of it. After all, it was just one night in a small, uneventful town. When I finally arrived in Ravenwood, the sun had already begun its slow descent, casting long shadows across the narrow streets. The neighborhood was eerily quiet, as if the entire town had decided to retire early for the evening. Most of the houses were dark, their windows lifeless, and thick oak trees lined the lawns, casting heavy shadows over everything. As I pulled into the gravel driveway, I noticed someone walking down the road, far enough away that I couldn't make out their face. They moved slowly, casually even, but there was something about the way they walked that made me uneasy. They were headed in the opposite direction of the Airbnb, so I brushed it off as nothing and carried on, unlocking the door and stepping inside. The Airbnb was a modest house, nothing particularly remarkable about it. Just a basic, clean space with all the essentials: a living room, a small kitchen, a bedroom, and a tiny bathroom. Perfect for my one-night stay. I took a few minutes to check out the place and make sure everything was in order. After getting a feel for the layout, I decided to grab my second bag from the car. Stepping onto the porch, I paused. There, in the middle of the road, stood the person I had seen walking earlier. This time, they weren't moving. They were just standing, facing the Airbnb, and staring directly at it. My heart skipped a beat. I tried to keep my movements calm as I made my way to the car, eyes never leaving the figure in the road. As I approached the vehicle, they turned and began walking away, resuming their slow, methodical pace down the road. I didn't know what to make of it. They could have just been taking a late-night stroll, but something about it felt wrong. I quickly retrieved my bag, locked the car, and pulled it into the garage for extra security. I double-checked that all the doors and windows were locked, then went back inside. For the next couple of hours, I kept glancing out the windows, half expecting to see the figure lingering somewhere outside, but they were nowhere to be seen. Eventually, exhaustion got the better of me, and I decided to turn in for the night. Sleep came in fits and starts. I woke up several times during the night, feeling uneasy, though I wasn't sure why. My alarm finally went off at 4 a.m., dragging me out of a restless sleep. The room was still dark, and groggily, I sat up in bed. That's when I noticed something strange, a faint light coming from under the bedroom door. I distinctly remembered turning off all the lights before bed, so the sight of the glow sent a shiver down my spine. My first thought was that I had somehow left the kitchen light on, but deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. Moving cautiously, I got out of bed and approached the door. Just as my hand touched the doorknob, I heard something. It was faint, but unmistakable. The sound of someone rummaging around at the end of the hallway. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly opened the door. The living room light was on, which I knew I had turned off, but the sound persisted, and when I peered around the corner, my blood ran cold. There, crouched in the corner of the living room, was a man. He was going through my bags, tossing things aside as if searching for something specific. He wore a black hoodie and ripped jeans, exactly what the person from the road had been wearing. My mind raced, trying to process the situation, but before I could do anything, the man looked up and locked eyes with me. He didn't seem startled, not even surprised. Instead, he just stood up slowly, as if he had been expecting me all along. "Stay where you are," he growled, his voice low and menacing. He dropped the bag and began to approach me, moving with purpose. Panic surged through me, and I had only a split second to react. I turned and bolted back to the bedroom, slamming the door shut behind me just as he reached it. His shoulder rammed into the door with a sickening thud, and I heard him curse under his breath as he started fiddling with the lock. I didn't have much time. My mind raced, searching for a way out, and then I remembered the bedroom window. Without a second thought, I yanked it open and climbed out, landing hard on the cold grass below. I didn't stop to look back. I just ran. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs ached, putting as much distance between myself and the house as possible. It wasn't until I reached a nearby gas station that I finally stopped and called the police. They arrived quickly, but by the time we returned to the Airbnb, the man was long gone. He had taken my bags, leaving the house in disarray. The scariest part? When the police checked the bedroom, the door was open. He had picked the lock. If I had hidden in the bathroom or under the bed, he would have found me. The officers speculated that the man's intentions went far beyond a simple burglary. I shuddered to think what might have happened if I hadn't gotten out when I did. The police promised to investigate, but deep down, I knew the chances of finding him were slim. I left Ravenwood that morning, but the image of the man's cold, expectant stare stayed with me. I pray I never cross paths with him again. The Wilderness Trap. This spring, I decided to go camping at a remote location, about 4 hours north of my hometown of Arcadia. There was a small lake tucked away deep in the woods, a place few people knew about. It was my favorite spot, perfect for a peaceful escape from the daily grind. Every time I went, I had the lake mostly to myself, and I appreciated the quiet serenity it offered. On the first day, I arrived at the lake around midday. The place was as tranquil as ever. I set up my tent near the shore, enjoying the gentle sound of the water lapping against the rocks. The lake wasn't huge, but it was beautiful. Its clear blue water surrounded by a grassy beach, which gave way to thick forests on all sides. I could see the whole perimeter from where I stood, and for a while, it looked like I had the place all to myself. However, just as I was settling into the peaceful isolation, I noticed a figure emerging from the woods on the other side of the lake. A man, about my age, was setting up his own tent. He seemed like just another camper, and I didn't think much of it at first. But as the sun began to set, I saw him making his way around the lake, walking directly toward my campsite. He approached with a friendly smile and introduced himself as Colin. "Hey, I didn't know anyone else knew about this spot," he said, his tone light and cheerful. Colin seemed easygoing, so I didn't feel alarmed. After all, it wasn't unusual to run into other campers, especially in a secluded place like this. He mentioned that he saw me setting up across the lake and wanted to say hello since it was rare to see anyone else out here. We talked for a bit, and Colin seemed like a decent guy. He was 28, only a couple of years younger than me, and we shared a similar love for the solitude the lake offered. He explained that he had come to this spot for the same reasons I had, to escape from the world and enjoy the peace and quiet of nature. After chatting for about 30 minutes, he waved goodbye and headed back to his campsite as the last light of the day faded. That night passed uneventfully. I watched the stars for a while before retreating to my tent. The silence of the woods was comforting. Morning came, and as I unzipped my tent and stepped outside, I saw Colin on the beach, looking out over the water. He waved and came over again. We spent the better part of the day hanging out by the lake. He even shared a 6-pack of beer with me, and we exchanged stories about our lives, work, and love for the outdoors. By evening, I was glad to have met him. Colin seemed like the perfect camping buddy. As night fell, and we parted ways to go back to our campsites, I was sitting by my small campfire, feeling content. The flames flickered gently, and the sounds of the night creatures were beginning to fill the air. It had been a good day, and I was looking forward to getting a good night's sleep. However, just as I was about to put out my campfire, I noticed Colin again. He was walking around the lake, coming straight toward my campsite. His own fire had gone out a while ago, so I assumed he had gone to bed, but apparently not. When he reached me, something seemed off. His earlier cheerfulness was gone, replaced by a strange intensity in his eyes. "Hey, everything all right?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. He smiled, but there was something unsettling about it. "I wanted to show you something," he said, his voice a little too eager. "There's a spot with an amazing view nearby, but you can only really appreciate it at night." I hesitated, glancing up at the sky. It was late, and the forest was pitch black. "I don't know, man. It's kind of late, and we've got a long day tomorrow." But Colin persisted. "Trust me, it's worth it. The view is incredible." Something in his tone made it hard to say no. Against my better judgment, I stood up and followed him. We walked along the shoreline before turning into the woods, where the trees grew denser. There was no path, and Colin didn't seem to need one. He navigated through the forest like he had done this 100 times before. The further we walked, the more uneasy I felt. After about 15 minutes, Colin suddenly stopped and pointed ahead. "There it is," he said. I stepped forward, expecting a breathtaking view, but instead I saw a decrepit old camper. The rusted structure was almost hidden by overgrown moss and vines, as if it had been abandoned for years. Confused, I turned back to Colin, but his expression had changed. His eyes were cold now, his face expressionless. "What is this?" I asked, my voice tense. Colin didn't answer. He just stared at me, his gaze empty. A chill ran down my spine, and instinctively I began to look around. That's when I heard it, the sound of metal creaking. The rusty door of the camper swung open, and another figure rushed out toward me. Without thinking, I turned and bolted. My heart pounded in my chest as I sprinted through the forest, branches whipping against my face. Behind me, I could hear both Colin and the other person chasing after me. I didn't stop. I couldn't. I ran until my lungs burned, blindly crashing through the trees. At some point, the sounds of pursuit faded. Gasping for breath, I slowed down, realizing I had no idea where I was. The dense trees loomed around me, and the night was eerily quiet. I had no choice but to keep walking, hoping that I would find my way back to the lake. Hours later, as the first light of dawn began to break through the canopy, I finally stumbled upon the lake. From the safety of the tree line, I looked toward my campsite. My tent, my gear, everything was gone. It was as if I had never been there. Whoever had taken away my belongings had not come with the idea to just steal my belongings. He had some other diabolical plans for the night, for sure. I didn't dare go back to investigate. Instead, I stayed hidden in the woods until I made my way to the trail that led to my car. When I reached my vehicle, I immediately drove to the nearest town and filed a report with the local police. They took down the details, but I could tell they didn't take it seriously. To this day, I don't know what Colin and his accomplice had planned for me, but I thank my instincts for getting me out of there before I found out. The thought of what could have happened still haunts me, and I haven't been back to that lake since. The trip of terror. I had been planning a solo backpacking trip for months, eager to escape the city and explore the rugged wilderness of the North Cascades. My chosen route was an out-and-back trail through the remote Boondock Mountains. The trail was known for its breathtaking views and solitude, stretching 6 days in total, 3 days out, 3 days back. I hadn't done much research on the popularity of the trail, but I wasn't too worried. Out in the backcountry, encounters with other hikers were rare. On the third day of my journey, I stumbled upon a small campsite just off the trail. To my surprise, a lone hiker sat by a crackling fire next to a worn-out tent. He waved as I approached, and I stopped for a break to chat. The man, who introduced himself as Luke, seemed friendly enough, though there was something vaguely unsettling about him. His hair was disheveled, and he had dark circles under his eyes like he hadn't slept in days. We exchanged stories about our hikes, and he mentioned that he was camping there for the night before heading up to the peak the next morning. I told him I planned to reach the peak by the end of the day, and maybe I'd see him up there. After a few minutes of idle conversation, I bid him farewell and continued on my way. The trail ahead was steep and challenging, but when I finally arrived at the summit, the view was unlike anything I had ever experienced. A vast expanse of snow-capped mountains and rolling forests stretched as far as the eye could see. I set up camp near the edge of the cliff, basking in the peacefulness that only true isolation could bring. That night, as I settled into my tent, I found myself thinking about Luke. He had seemed so eager to reach the peak, but as the sun dipped behind the mountains, there was still no sign of him. Maybe he decided to stay at his previous camp for another night, I reasoned, or perhaps he had turned around altogether. Either way, it was none of my concern. I had the entire mountaintop to myself, and the night passed in blissful solitude. The next morning, I packed up and began the descent back down the trail. My body was sore from the climb, and I found myself moving much slower than anticipated. The sun was already sinking below the horizon when I finally neared the same campsite where I had met Luke. His tent was still there, set up just as it had been the day before, but something was off. I called out, "Luke, you okay?" There was no response. A sense of unease crept over me as I approached the tent. The flap was half open, but the inside was empty. No sleeping bag, no gear, nothing. It was as if Luke had vanished. My stomach tightened with a growing sense of dread. People don't just leave their camp set up in the middle of nowhere without a trace. I stood there for a moment, scanning the surrounding woods for any sign of him. That's when I saw it, a faint glimmer of light in the distance, deep within the trees. It flickered faintly, like a dying headlamp. Instinctively, I began walking toward it, my pulse quickening. About 40 yards from the campsite, I found the source, a headlamp lying on the ground, barely clinging to life as its batteries drained away. Suddenly, I felt a presence. My skin prickled with the unmistakable sensation of being watched. I turned slowly, and there, just a few yards away, stood a figure in the shadows. They were too far to make out any details, but their posture told me all I needed to know. They were trying to remain hidden. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. "Do you need help?" The figure didn't move, didn't speak. They just stood there, watching. I'm sorry. I'll leave," I stammered, taking a step back. Panic gripped me, and I quickly turned and headed back toward the campsite. The moment I reached Luke's tent, the faint glow of the headlamp in the woods vanished. With shaking hands, I grabbed my pack and slung it over my shoulders, thankful that I hadn't unpacked much. I took one last glance at the shadowy trees before setting off down the trail, moving as quickly as my legs would allow. The darkness swallowed me, but I didn't dare stop. I had to get away from whatever, or whoever, was out there. I pushed myself hard, managing to cover another 3 miles before I reached the next campsite. My heart was still racing, but the presence of other hikers, distant fires flickering in the night, brought some measure of comfort. I wasted no time reporting what I had seen. The rangers took down my story, but their expressions told me they'd heard similar accounts before. A search was conducted in the following days. They found Luke's tent, just as I had described it, but there was no sign of him. No tracks, no gear, no clues as to where he might have gone. The headlamp I'd found was gone too, as if it had never been there at all. The authorities deemed Luke missing, though deep down, I knew that missing wasn't the right word. Whoever that figure was in the woods, they had something to do with his disappearance. And I shudder to think what would have happened if I had stayed at that camp a moment longer. The mystery of Luke's fate remains unsolved, but out in the wilderness, some things are better left unknown. The trip to the woods, I had been visiting my college buddy, Ethan, in his small hometown of Clearwater, far from the bustling city life I was used to. The town was quaint, nestled between thick woods and meandering rivers, and it felt a world away from the fast-paced lifestyle I'd grown accustomed to. Ethan and I had spent the last few days catching up, visiting old hangouts, and hitting a couple of local bars. On the last night of my stay, he brought up something intriguing, something he hadn't mentioned during my previous visits. "There's this place," Ethan started, his tone a mix of excitement and hesitation. "A small abandoned settlement out in the woods. I've been meaning to check it out, but I didn't want to go alone." Curiosity piqued. I asked him for more details. According to Ethan, it was a set of homes that had been abandoned abruptly years ago, and no one in town ever really spoke about why. The idea reminded me of the adventures we had during college, hiking through forests and exploring old, forgotten places. The thought of ending my trip with one last thrill was too tempting to resist. Within half an hour, we were off, hiking through a narrow trail into the dense forest behind Clearwater. The sun was low, casting an eerie golden glow through the trees, but we were prepared with headlamps, just in case darkness crept in faster than expected. The trail soon disappeared, and we found ourselves walking along a faint, overgrown footpath, pushing through the underbrush as the air grew colder. After what felt like an hour of hiking, the outline of a house came into view, standing silently among the trees. As we approached, more houses appeared behind it, revealing an entire small settlement tucked away in the woods. Oddly enough, the homes didn't look as old as I had imagined. Sure, they were weathered and worn down, but they had modern siding, and the windows, though broken, didn't seem like they belonged to a century-old structure. A gravel road wound through the cluster of homes, leading us from one to the next. Graffiti littered the sides of some buildings, and it became clear that we weren't the first people to explore the place. Ethan and I approached the first house, its front door hanging crooked on its hinges. Weeds pushed through the floorboards, but the inside was otherwise barren, giving no real clues about why the homes had been deserted. As we prepared to step inside, a loud slam echoed through the quiet woods, coming from somewhere down the gravel road. Both Ethan and I froze, our eyes darting toward the sound. Silence followed, but the sudden noise left a gnawing tension in the air. "Did you hear that?" I asked, already knowing the answer. Ethan nodded, his face pale. We waited, listening for any further sounds, but the forest had fallen completely silent. After a few moments, we cautiously entered the house, exploring the empty first floor. The eeriness of the place was unsettling, and I found myself constantly glancing over my shoulder. Upstairs, the atmosphere felt different, heavier, darker. The hallway at the top of the staircase was small, with only 2 doors and a hatch leading to the attic. We opened the first door and found another bare room. As we were about to check the next one, we heard it, a faint shuffling sound coming from outside. Someone was walking through the grass, their footsteps slow and deliberate, heading straight for the house. Ethan motioned for me to stay quiet as we listened. The footsteps grew louder, approaching the front of the house, then stopped just outside the doorway. "Hello?" a raspy voice called out. "I just want to talk. No harm at all." The voice sent chills down my spine. It sounded strange, slurred, like the man speaking was struggling to form the words properly. I glanced at Ethan, who looked just as uneasy as I felt. Neither of us responded. "I know you're in there," the man continued, his tone almost playful now. "Come on, don't be shy." Then there was silence. No footsteps, no words, nothing. Minutes passed. We stayed perfectly still, listening intently, but we didn't hear the man leave. Something was off. Ethan, unable to contain his nerves any longer, motioned for me to stay back as he quietly crept down the stairs to take a peek outside. When he returned, his face was drained of color. "He's not there," Ethan whispered. "What do you mean, he's not there?" I asked, rushing over to join him at the doorway. Sure enough, the front of the house was empty. The only evidence of anyone having been there were a single set of footprints leading toward the door. But there were no prints leaving. It hit us both at the same time. The man hadn't left. He was still inside the house. We didn't waste another second. Without a word, we bolted from the house, racing down the gravel road and toward the safety of the trees. My heart pounded in my chest, the sound of my own footsteps ringing in my ears. I didn't dare look back, afraid of what or who I might see. We didn't stop running until we reached the main trail, where the forest finally opened up into the outskirts of town. Gasping for breath, we glanced back in the direction we had come, half expecting the man to emerge from the woods behind us, but no one followed. We made it back to Ethan's house without another word. We didn't discuss what had happened or who that man might have been. All we knew was that we were lucky to have left when we did. To this day, I still get chills thinking about that voice and those footprints leading to nowhere. Whoever or whatever had been out there in that abandoned settlement, we weren't meant to meet them. And I'm certain that if we had stayed any longer, we might not have made it out at all. A dark stop on Redwater Road. I had been driving across the country for nearly a week, heading to the northern tip of Washington State for an urgent work meeting. Since I was already on the road, I decided to combine the trip with visits to family and friends along the West Coast. By the 4th day, I found myself weaving through the isolated highways of northern Idaho. While the scenery was beautiful, with towering evergreens and distant mountains, the roads were long, desolate, and mostly devoid of life. My GPS had rerouted me through some remote backroads, which I didn't mind at first, thinking it would add a bit of adventure to the journey. As the day turned into dusk, the sky began to darken, and heavy rain started pouring down. It wasn't just a drizzle. It was one of those relentless downpours that makes it hard to see even a few feet in front of your car. My fuel gauge was edging dangerously close to empty, and I hadn't passed a gas station in over an hour. I told myself that there had to be one soon. After all, I was still following the GPS, and it would surely lead me somewhere. Another half hour passed, and I still hadn't seen a single town. The road, now slick with rain, was surrounded by thick trees on both sides. I felt a creeping sense of unease, but I tried to ignore it. Just as I was beginning to panic about running out of fuel in the middle of nowhere, I spotted a faded sign through the rain. Redwater Gas, 2 miles. Relief flooded me. A few minutes later, I saw it up ahead, tucked into the woods, a small gas station with 2 ancient-looking pumps. It didn't look like much, but at this point, I didn't have a choice. I pulled in under the dim, flickering overhang and parked near one of the pumps. The place looked abandoned, with weeds growing through cracks in the pavement. The rain hammered down, and it was hard to make out much in the dark, but I saw a small concession building behind the pumps. No other cars were around, and it looked like I was alone. I quickly got out, opened my gas tank, and grabbed the nozzle. When I swiped my card, nothing happened. The screen was blank. I squinted through the rain and wiped off the pump's display. Still nothing. Sighing in frustration, I walked over to the second pump. It was the same, completely dead. At this point, I realized something was seriously wrong. No lights were on outside, but I noticed a faint glow coming from the window of the concession building. Maybe someone was inside who could help me. I jogged through the rain, approaching the glass door. It was covered in grime, and the reflection of the light made it impossible to see inside. With a sense of dread settling over me, I grabbed the handle. The door creaked loudly as I pushed it open, the sound echoing in the empty space. Stepping inside, I immediately felt a chill. The air was damp and the shelves were bare, some knocked over like they hadn't been touched in years. The faint light I'd seen was coming from a small lamp near the back of the store, casting long shadows across the room. It wasn't the fluorescent lighting you'd expect in a gas station. It looked like someone had set up a makeshift camp inside. I stood there for a few seconds, my skin crawling with unease. Something wasn't right. I turned and hurried back outside into the rain. As I neared my car, my heart stopped. There was someone standing next to it. The figure was drenched from head to toe, their clothes clinging to their body. They were hunched over, peering into my car windows as if searching for something. For a moment, I froze, unsure of what to do. "Hey, what are you doing?" I shouted, trying to sound more confident than I felt. The person straightened up and turned to face me, their eyes locking onto mine. There was something unsettling about the way they looked at me, like they were sizing me up. Without a word, they shifted their gaze behind me, toward the concession building. I turned just in time to see another figure stepping out of the gas station. He had long, stringy black hair and a gaunt, sickly look to him. His clothes were dirty, and he moved with an unnatural quickness. Before I could react, he broke into a sprint, heading straight for me. Panic surged through my body. I bolted for my car, my heart pounding in my chest. The man was fast, too fast. I barely managed to get the door open and slam it shut before he reached me. He yanked at the door handle, pulling so hard that the car rocked. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking as I tried to start the engine. Just as the engine roared to life, I heard a metallic screech. The man had run something, maybe a knife, along the side of my car. Without looking back, I slammed on the gas and sped out of the station, my tires skidding on the wet pavement. I drove for what felt like an eternity, my eyes darting between the road and the rearview mirror. My heart was still racing, and I couldn't shake the image of the two figures standing in the rain, watching me. After about 30 minutes, my car finally sputtered to a stop. I'd run out of gas. Thankfully, I had cell service. I called for roadside assistance and waited anxiously in the dark. While I waited, I stepped out to inspect the damage to my car. A long, jagged scratch ran across the driver's side door. It looked like the man had scraped it with something sharp as I drove away. I shuddered, thinking about how close I had come to a very different outcome. When the police arrived later that night, I told them everything. They looked at me with concern and disbelief. One of the officers told me that the gas station on Redwater Road hadn't been operational for over a decade. They had boarded it up years ago after a string of incidents involving people going missing in the area. I still don't know what those men wanted or what would have happened if I hadn't gotten away in time. The thought sends shivers down my spine every time I think about it. All I know is that something terrible lurks on those forgotten roads, waiting for the next unsuspecting traveler. The sheer terror of the place still haunts me every now and then whenever I think how close I had come to absolute calamity. The intruder at the house. It was mid-August last year, and my house was facing some serious electrical problems. The power had been out for a few days, and as I work from home, this was a major disruption. After a few days of struggling to get things fixed, I finally gave in and rented an Airbnb. Living in a fairly small town, there weren't many options nearby, but I managed to find a place about a 45-minute drive away, in the outskirts of a neighboring village called Cedar Ridge. It was known for being a bit run down and secluded, but I was only staying for a couple of days, so I figured it was manageable. Plus, the price was affordable. When I arrived at the Airbnb, I didn't spend much time looking around. The long drive and the stress of the last few days had worn me out, and I headed straight to bed. The next morning, I woke up early, ready to set up my laptop and start catching up on work. Just as I was about to begin, a knock echoed through the house. It startled me for a moment, and I wondered who it could be. After all, this wasn't my home. Hesitant, I went to the door and peeked through the peephole. On the other side stood a man, maybe in his early 30s, with tattoos covering his arms and neck. He didn't look like the Airbnb host or anyone I'd expect to see there. Unsure of his intentions and not feeling comfortable opening the door, I decided to ignore it. I walked back to my desk and started working, hoping that whoever it was would just leave. The day flew by as I caught up on meetings and worked through a pile of tasks. Before I knew it, it was nearly 8 p.m., and I hadn't even stepped away from my desk. Needing a break, I went out to grab some dinner. After returning, I had barely started eating when another knock came at the door. My stomach tightened as I realized it was the same man from earlier. I was more annoyed than scared at this point, but again, I ignored it and walked back to finish my meal. I tried to push the situation out of my mind, convincing myself that maybe he had the wrong house or was selling something. About half an hour later, I sat back down to work for another hour before calling it a night. I put my headphones in, trying to drown out my unease, and focused on getting things done. When I finally shut my laptop, I noticed how dark it had gotten in the house. The only light had been coming from my screen. As I stood up and went to turn on the front light, I felt a chill run down my spine. Faint shoe prints were visible in the dim light, leading from the back door and all the way up to the desk where I had been sitting. My breath caught in my throat as I followed the prints with my eyes. They led straight to the back door, which was cracked open slightly. I froze. My mind raced with the realization that someone had been inside the house while I was working. I felt nauseous with fear. Before I could process what was happening, I heard the slow, deliberate creak of footsteps descending the stairs. My heart pounded as a man came into view, peeking around the corner of the hallway. It was him, the same tattooed man from earlier, and now he was in the house. His face morphed from surprise to fury as our eyes met. Panic surged through me. Without thinking, I turned and bolted through the back door, running into the dark backyard. I didn't stop until I was deep into the woods behind the property, hiding behind a large tree. My hands shook as I fumbled for my phone, dialing 911. Just as I was about to speak to the operator, I heard footsteps crashing through the trees behind me. He was following me. I held my breath and prayed he wouldn't find me. Moments later, the footsteps passed, and I stayed hidden, too terrified to move. When I finally got through to the police, I explained everything and waited for them to arrive. I crept back to the Airbnb, constantly looking over my shoulder. When the officers arrived, I gave them a full description of the man. They assured me they would find him. The next day, the police called with news. They had arrested him, and it was the same man I had described, identified by his distinct tattoos. He had been breaking into homes in the area, committing violent crimes against the residents. I shuddered at the thought of what might have happened if I hadn't run when I did. Though I still don't know why he didn't act sooner, or what his intentions were, I'm relieved knowing he's behind bars and can't hurt anyone else. A stranger in the woods, a hiker's near escape. Last summer, I decided to take a solo camping and hiking trip along Pine Creek, a remote river near my childhood home. Visiting my parents for a few days, I wanted to escape into nature afterward and enjoy a peaceful retreat. Pine Creek wasn't a popular destination. It was a quiet spot only locals knew about, far removed from any tourist trail. It was the perfect place to unwind. The hike to the river took about 4 hours at a steady pace. I loved the isolation, knowing that no one else ever used the narrow dirt path that snaked through the dense forest. The river, though small and often overlooked, held a special charm for me, calm and peaceful, untouched by crowds. The trail was unmarked, and few people ever ventured this far. By the time I reached the river, the sun was sinking below the horizon, so I quickly set up my tent and built a fire, eager to relax before turning in for the night. The crackling fire cast flickering shadows on the trees as I sat down, enjoying the solitude. I had barely settled in when I heard footsteps crunching through the leaves. Startled, I turned to see a man emerging from the forest. He was in his early 30s, scruffy and dirty, like he'd been out here for days. He waved at me and approached with a casual smile. "Hey there, I'm Ben," he said, extending his hand. I hesitated before shaking it. He seemed friendly enough, but something about him felt off. Ben mentioned that he was camping nearby and had noticed my fire. He claimed he'd been out in these woods for a few days and was just wandering around. I made small talk, not wanting to be rude, but my instincts were screaming at me. Something wasn't right. After a few minutes, he said goodnight and walked off along the river, his flashlight bobbing in the darkness. I watched him go, but after a minute or so, the light abruptly clicked off. The forest fell silent again, save for the crackle of my fire. I tried to brush off the encounter as nothing more than an awkward meeting in the woods, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he'd been watching me long before he stepped out from the trees. How else would he have shown up just minutes after I arrived? It was almost like he had been following me. Shaking off the unease, I doused the fire and retreated to my tent. It took me a while to fall asleep, but eventually the exhaustion from the day's hike caught up with me. The next morning, I woke with the sun and decided to spend the day exploring the area. I hiked along the river, expecting to come across Ben's campsite, but there were no signs of anyone else out here. No tent, no fire pit, nothing. It was as if he'd vanished. A gnawing anxiety settled in my stomach, but I pushed it aside, convincing myself he must be camped deeper in the woods. I returned to my camp just as the sun was setting. To my shock, Ben was sitting next to my unlit fire pit, waiting for me. "Hey," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "What are you doing here?" He smiled again, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I found something down by the river earlier. You should come check it out." I hesitated, the uneasy feeling from the night before surging back. "I'm pretty tired, actually," I said, forcing a casual tone. "Maybe another time." His smile faltered, and for a moment we just stared at each other. Something in his eyes had changed. There was no friendliness left. "Come on," he insisted, his voice lower now, more insistent. "It won't take long." My heart pounded in my chest as I realized how dangerous the situation had become. I glanced down and noticed something bulging from the waistband of his pants. A gun. It was tucked under his shirt, hidden from view. That was when I knew for sure. This wasn't just a strange encounter. Ben was a predator. "I'm not going," I said, my voice firmer this time. We locked eyes for a long, tense moment with this, and I was terrified he would pull the gun on me right then and there. But instead, he turned without a word and walked back toward the river, disappearing into the trees. As soon as he was out of sight, I started packing up my gear as quickly and quietly as possible. My hands shook as I stuffed my tent into my bag and doused the remains of the fire. Every noise in the forest felt amplified in the silence, and I was sure Ben was watching me from the darkness, waiting for the right moment to strike. I didn't care that it was getting dark. I knew I had to leave. I strapped my pack to my back and started the long hike back, my heart pounding with every step. The 4-hour hike in daylight had been easy, but navigating the unmarked trail at night with the constant fear of Ben behind me was a nightmare. Every twig snap or rustle in the bushes sent a jolt of fear through me. Several times, I thought I heard footsteps trailing behind me, but every time I turned around, there was nothing. Still, I knew he was there, somewhere in the dark, watching, waiting for me to slow down or make a mistake. I pushed through the exhaustion and fear, refusing to stop even for a second. After what felt like an eternity, I finally reached the road where my car was parked. My hands were shaking so badly that it took me 3 tries to get the key in the ignition. But once I was in, I locked the doors and sped away without looking back. Even now, the memory of that night sends chills down my spine. I'm convinced that if I had followed Ben down to the river, I wouldn't be here to tell this story. Whoever he was, whatever his intentions, they were nothing short of sinister. The terror at the lake. Camping had always been an escape for my friend Brian. He grew up camping with his family, and it had become a tradition for him to take at least 1 or 2 trips a year. I was introduced to the world of camping through Brian when we were roommates in college. Back then, we would go out into the woods whenever we could, but now, with work and life weighing us down, our adventures had become less frequent. It was 2 years ago when we went on our last camping trip together, one that would change our view of the wilderness forever. We picked a secluded spot near Shadow Lake, an area Brian had heard about from a fellow camper. It was supposed to be serene, tucked away from the usual tourist paths, and perfect for an undisturbed, peaceful experience. We weren't there to hike long distances or conquer mountains. We simply wanted to enjoy nature, relax by the fire, and spend a few nights under the stars. After driving for a couple of hours and then hiking for another 2, we found the perfect clearing close to the lake's edge. There was something almost eerie about how quiet it was. No birds chirping, no rustling leaves, just pure, unbroken silence. We set up our tents, started a fire, and settled in for what we thought would be another memorable camping trip. For the next 3 days, it was exactly as planned. We had some beers, swapped stories, went on short walks around the lake, and just enjoyed the simplicity of it all. On the 4th day, we decided to pack up the next morning and head back home. As the sun began to dip below the horizon that evening, Brian said he wanted to take a short walk and collect some sticks for our last campfire. He asked me to get the food prepped while he was gone. "I'll be back in 10, maybe 15 minutes," he said, grabbing his flashlight before disappearing into the trees. 15 minutes passed, and Brian hadn't returned. I wasn't too worried at first. He liked wandering off and taking his time to explore, but then 30 minutes went by, and it was getting darker by the second. I called out his name a few times, but there was no response. I started to feel a tinge of unease. Brian knew these woods better than anyone I knew. Getting lost wasn't something that would happen to him. I figured maybe he got distracted by the scenery or found something cool. But as more time passed, the knot in my stomach tightened. When an hour had gone by, the sun had completely set, and the eerie quiet of the forest was now amplified by the dark. I lit our large camping lantern and started gathering some sticks to make a fire. My thoughts were racing. Should I go look for him? What if I get lost? What if something had happened? I kept trying to calm myself, reasoning that maybe Brian had just decided to take a longer walk than expected. But when 2 hours had passed, I was getting genuinely scared. Suddenly, the quiet night was broken by the sound of a gunshot. My heart raced. The shot had come from the direction Brian had gone in. We hadn't brought any guns with us, so who could it have been? Every fiber of my being screamed at me to go look for Brian, but at the same time, I was terrified. What if I ran into whoever had fired that shot? I stood frozen for what felt like minutes, but was probably just a few seconds before I heard footsteps coming toward me. Fast, running footsteps. I gripped the lantern tightly, my hand trembling as the footsteps grew louder and louder, and then, through the dim light, I saw Brian. He was sprinting towards the campsite, and his face looked horrified. His eyes were wide, his breath came in panicked gasps, and sweat covered his brow. "We need to leave, now!" Brian barked, his voice hoarse and urgent. Without asking questions, I quickly grabbed my backpack and threw it over my shoulders. "What's going on?" I asked, but Brian refused to answer. His hands were shaking as he packed up his things, and I could see the terror written all over his face. This wasn't like him. Brian was the guy who stayed calm in every situation. As we started speed walking out of the woods, Brian finally began to speak. He told me that while he was out gathering sticks, a man had approached him, seemingly out of nowhere. The man was holding a gun and demanded Brian follow him without making a sound. He kept pointing the gun at me, leading me deeper into the woods, Brian said, his voice barely a whisper. I tried to stay calm, tried to figure out what this guy wanted, but he wouldn't say much, just kept telling me to keep walking. My skin prickled. What did he want? I don't know, Brian muttered, but he was taking me somewhere bad. He wasn't just robbing me. I could feel it. I waited for the right moment, and I bolted. I remembered the gunshot I had heard and felt a cold dread wash over me. The gunshot. What happened? Brian shook his head. I don't want to talk about it, he said, his voice firm. And I knew then that he was holding back something important. As we moved through the forest, every shadow seemed more menacing. Every crack of a twig underfoot made us both jump. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. After what felt like an eternity, we finally made it back to our car. We didn't even stop to catch our breath. We got in, slammed the doors shut, and drove away as fast as we could. Brian has refused to go camping ever since, and honestly, I don't blame him. The man in the woods, the gunshot, the fear in Brian's eyes, it was all too real. I still think about that night and wonder what really happened out there. Brian never gave me the full story, and maybe I don't want to know. But one thing is for sure. There's something about Shadow Lake that I'll never forget, and I have no intention of ever going back. The Curse of the Jade Pond. There's a mountain just outside the quiet village where my grandmother lives, deep in the heart of Southeast Asia. Nestled within that mountain is a beautiful jade-green pond that sparkles like a gemstone, shimmering under the sunlight. The pond is so green it seems unreal, as though it's been pulled from a dream. The villagers call it Talaga Hijau, or the Green Pool. I've always been fascinated by it. Whenever I visited my grandmother, I'd ask about the pond, but the adults always brushed me off with the same warning: stay away from the Talaga Hijau. You don't need to know why. Just don't go near it. That only fueled my curiosity. Why was this beautiful pond forbidden? What could be so dangerous about it? Even the other kids in the village wondered the same. Rumors swirled around Talaga Hijau like the monsoon winds. Anyone who goes there doesn't return, some said. Others whispered about how the pond was bottomless, that it would swallow you whole if you fell in. Still, none of us had the courage to see for ourselves. But when I reached junior high school, the fear began to wane, and logic started to creep in. When I returned to the village during school breaks, the kids I used to play with, Reza, Anya, and her cousin Imran, were as curious as I was. Reza, always the bold one, said, "If no one ever comes back, how does anyone know what it looks like?" And if it was really bottomless, Imran added, someone would have filled it in by now. No one would just leave it there. We all agreed. The legends surrounding Talaga Hijau were likely just stories to scare little kids. The idea of a mysterious, cursed pond was fun when we were younger, but now we wanted to find out the truth. "Let's check it out," Anya suggested one afternoon. She was the adventurous one, always pushing boundaries. We planned to meet early the next morning and hike to the pond. The mountain was small, and although we'd never been to the pond, we knew the general direction. It would be a short trek, or so we thought. The sun had barely risen when we met at the edge of the village and began our hike. Reza, Anya, Imran, and I climbed through the dense forest, chatting and laughing as we went. The mountain was lush and thick with foliage, and before long, we were panting from the heat and humidity. After nearly 3 hours of hiking, we found a peculiar area where the trees grew unnaturally close together. It was like someone had deliberately planted them in rows, blocking our way forward. Anya, as usual, led the charge. "It has to be through here," she said, squeezing between the tightly packed trees. We had no choice but to follow her. As we pushed through the dense forest, the trees suddenly opened up to reveal Talaga Hijau. It was even more breathtaking than I had imagined. The jade-green water shimmered in the dappled sunlight filtering through the trees. The pond was eerily quiet, like the world had paused around it, but something was off. There was an old wooden shack standing at the edge of the pond, its wood rotting and overgrown with moss. It spoiled the otherwise idyllic scene. We stood in awe for a moment, the beauty of the pond temporarily overwhelming our unease. Then, Anya broke the silence, pulling out a small bottle from her backpack. "Let's take some of the water back," she said, crouching by the edge of the pond to fill it. Reza and Imran, however, were more interested in the shack. "What do you think's in there?" Reza asked, his voice low. Imran shrugged. "Only one way to find out." They walked towards the shack, but something stopped me. The whole place felt wrong. I didn't want to get closer, and I wasn't alone. Reza hesitated too, stopping just a few feet from the entrance. "I'll wait here," he muttered, his usual bravado gone. "Scared?" Anya teased, joining him. She was already inside the shack before Reza could respond, Imran right behind her. That left me and Reza standing by the pond. I tried to laugh it off, but the truth was I was just as scared as he was. The air around the pond felt heavy, like it was pressing down on us. "Why didn't you go in?" I asked, hoping to distract myself from the growing sense of dread. Reza's face darkened. "I don't like it," he said, staring at the shack. "Something's wrong. I have a bad feeling." "But Anya and Imran are fine," I pointed out. "Why is it okay for them to go in?" He turned towards me, his voice bitter. "I don't care about them. I came here for one reason." His voice dropped to a whisper. "To call Nagaratu." I frowned. "What's Nagaratu? You've never heard of her?" Reza's eyes gleamed with a strange intensity. "The queen of the serpents. She lives here in the pond. If you ask her, she'll grant you anything." A chill ran down my spine. "Grant you what?" Reza grinned, but it wasn't a friendly smile. "Revenge. She'll kill anyone you ask her to." I laughed nervously, thinking it was a joke, but Reza's expression didn't change. "You think I'm joking? I hate them, both of them, Anya and Imran. They've always looked down on me, always pushed me around, but today Nagaratu will fix that." Something about his voice sent a shiver through me. He wasn't just angry. He was serious. I suddenly realized I didn't know Reza as well as I thought. He was different, darker, colder. "I should check on them," I mumbled, edging towards the shack. But before I could take more than a few steps, Reza grabbed my arm. "Don't. It's too late for them." I yanked my arm free and hurried towards the shack, fear growing in my chest. The door creaked open with a soft groan as I stepped inside. The air was thick with a foul, rotting smell. As I moved further into the dark room, I heard it, a soft, eerie laugh. "Ha! Ha! Ha!" My heart raced as I turned the corner. Anya and Imran were sitting on the floor, their backs against the wall. They were laughing, but it wasn't normal. It was a chilling, high-pitched cackle that echoed off the walls. "Ha! Ha!" I took a step closer, but they didn't react. They just kept laughing, their eyes wide and unfocused, as if they didn't even see me. Panic surged through me, and I backed away. As I turned to run, something in the corner of the room caught my eye, two glowing white orbs floating in midair. I froze. The orbs blinked slowly, and then they moved toward me. Eyes. They were eyes, glowing white like the blind eyes of something ancient and evil. My body wouldn't move. I was paralyzed with fear. Behind me, the laughter grew louder. The white eyes were fixed on me now, unblinking, drawing closer with each passing second. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. Suddenly, a voice whispered in my ear, "It's too late for you, too." I spun around and saw Reza standing in the doorway, his eyes just as white as the ones floating in the air. His mouth twisted into a grin, his laughter mixing with that of Anya and Imran. "Ha! Ha! Ha!" I stumbled backward, my hands brushing against the sticky, wet walls. My breath came in ragged gasps as I bolted out of the shack, Reza's laughter ringing in my ears. I ran, my legs burning as I fled down the mountain, the sound of their eerie laughter echoing in the trees behind me. When I finally reached the village, drenched in sweat and trembling with fear, the first person I saw was Anya's grandmother. She looked at me with wide eyes, and before I could speak, she grabbed my shoulders. "You went to Telaga Hijau, didn't you?" she cried, shaking me. I nodded, too scared to respond. "It's too late," she whispered, her face pale. "The curse has already begun." The ghostly figure. I don't consider myself a great storyteller, so bear with me. What I'm about to share is a chapter of my life I'd rather forget, but it's etched into my mind forever. I've since moved out of the house where this took place, but the memory still haunts me. This story dates back to my childhood, to a time when things that couldn't be explained started happening. I must have been around 5 years old when I first felt something wasn't right in our house. Like most kids, I slept in my parents' room. The three of us tucked under the same roof on the second floor. Our house was old, over 100 years old, to be precise, passed down through the generations. My parents weren't exactly the superstitious type, but even they couldn't deny the things that happened within those walls. The house creaked and groaned at night like most old houses do. But these weren't just the typical noises you'd expect from an ancient building settling into the ground. No, I heard footsteps. Footsteps that seemed to move around when no one was supposed to be awake. The sounds were distinct. Sometimes they were the heavy, deliberate steps of an adult, slow and measured, echoing through the quiet of the night. Jishy, jishy. Other times, it was the rapid, light pattering of a child running. Peta, peta, peta. It wasn't just me who heard them either. One night, I whispered to my mom, "Can you hear that? The footsteps downstairs?" She sighed, as though she had heard them too many times to be frightened anymore. "Yeah, I hear them," she said softly. "That's your great-grandfather." Her voice didn't waver, as if this was just a matter of fact. "And sometimes they sound like a child," I continued, unsure if I wanted to hear the answer. "Those are your father's sister's footsteps," she replied matter-of-factly. She died when she was very young. The house, built by my great-grandfather, had been home to several generations of my family. While my great-grandmother, grandparents, and even my parents were still alive, the footsteps were said to belong to those who weren't, the spirits of my great-grandfather and my father's sister who had died as a baby. Surprisingly, I wasn't scared back then. My mother's nonchalant attitude made it seem as though the presence of these spirits was nothing to worry about. But as I grew older, things started to change. The footsteps became more frequent, and soon I experienced something far worse: sleep paralysis. I didn't know what sleep paralysis was at the time, but it happened often, especially during my junior high years. It started as a feeling of being stuck in my bed, unable to move no matter how much I tried. But soon, the sleep paralysis came with terrifying dreams. I still remember one of those dreams vividly. It was night, and I was walking down a familiar street in my town. Everything was black and white, like the colors had been drained from the world. I was holding hands with a childhood friend, and we were talking about nothing important, just normal, silly stuff. Then my friend stopped. "What's that?" he asked, pointing behind us. I turned around, and there it was. A figure, no taller than an adult, but it wasn't human. It was a shadow. A writhing, shifting shadow that stood upright as if it had its own form, its own life. It didn't belong to anyone. No person was casting it. The shadow was alone, and it was moving toward us. It didn't walk. It teleported. One moment it was far away. The next it had closed the distance between us without moving a muscle. The fear that gripped me in that moment was unlike anything I had ever felt before. I grabbed my friend's hand, and we ran. But no matter how fast we went, the shadow kept getting closer, disappearing and reappearing, muttering something that I couldn't understand. We were trapped. The shadow was about to catch us. Then I woke up. My eyes shot open, and I was back in my bed. But I couldn't move. My body was frozen, locked in place by something unseen. I could only move my eyes, scanning the room. Everything was still, but the terror from the dream lingered. I felt like that shadow was still there, lurking in the corners of my room, waiting. Eventually, the paralysis faded, and I regained control of my body. But I was too scared to sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of what had happened. Was it just a dream, or was something truly haunting me? The sleep paralysis happened again the next night, and again the night after that. Each time, it was the same. I would wake up from a dream, trapped in my own body, unable to move, with the suffocating feeling that something was watching me. Each time, I sensed the shadow from my dream, standing just out of sight, waiting for me to slip up and look directly at it. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I woke up, my body rigid with paralysis, and I felt something near the door. I turned my head slowly, and there it was, the shadow. It was standing at the foot of my bed, closer than it had ever been. Its form was indistinct, but I could tell it was looking at me, watching. I shut my eyes tight, praying for it to go away. But it didn't. I could feel its presence beside me, like a weight pressing down on the air. It was suffocating. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours, and then, finally, it was morning. After that night, the shadow visits became less frequent, but I never forgot the feeling. The sensation of being trapped, the helplessness, the terror of knowing that something was in the room with me. Even now, living in my new home, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, afraid to open my eyes, terrified that I'll see that shadow standing by my bed once again. It's been years, but some things you can never forget. The shadow still haunts me, lingering at the edges of my mind, and though I've moved on, I know deep down it's never truly left. The haunting at Briarcliff Cabin. It was the summer of last year when everything went down. My friend Jake's grandmother had passed away, leaving behind her property in a secluded village called Briarcliff. It was a small, quiet town, far from the bustling city of Halifax, and Jake, being her only grandchild, had inherited the place. Among the various properties she owned, there was a detached cabin by the woods, separate from the main house, which had remained largely unused for years. With the house sitting vacant, Jake invited me, along with two other friends, Michael and Sean, to spend a weekend at the cabin. He figured it would be a good way to clear his head after the funeral and to honor his grandmother's memory with some downtime. The cabin, though small, was more than enough for the four of us. It had a tiny kitchen, bathroom, and 2 bedrooms with tatami-style mats for sleeping. Situated on the edge of a dense forest, the cabin felt isolated, which we figured was perfect for a weekend getaway. The air was crisp, the sounds of nature all around us, and the serene environment seemed like a great escape from the city. The first night, after a few drinks and a barbecue out by the fire pit, we drifted off to sleep, exhausted from the day's activities. The thick, peaceful silence of the forest wrapped around us as we slept soundly. Sometime during the middle of the night, I woke up with an urgent need to pee. Groggily, I rolled over and checked on the others. Jake and Michael were fast asleep, their soft snores filling the room. I grabbed a small flashlight from my bag and quietly crept down the hall toward the bathroom. As I got closer to the bathroom, I noticed something odd. The frosted glass door of the bathroom had a light shining from within. At first, I thought one of the guys had woken up before me, gone in, and forgotten to switch the light off. I knocked softly. "Hey, you in there?" I said, waiting for a response. There was none. I rattled the doorknob but found it locked. Confused, I knocked again, a little louder this time. Still no answer. Now fully awake, I knocked once more, harder this time. "Come on, I just need to pee. Hurry up." The silence persisted. Then suddenly, I saw movement behind the frosted glass. A shadow shifted, just faintly, but it was unmistakable. Someone, or something, was inside. A cold shiver ran down my spine as reality hit me. Everyone was supposed to be asleep in the other room. I turned and bolted back to the room where Jake and Michael were, shaking them both awake. "Guys, wake up! There's something weird going on." Still half asleep, Jake groaned. "What are you talking about? It's the middle of the night." Just as Jake was about to brush me off, we all heard it. A loud bang coming from the hallway. It sounded like someone was rattling the bathroom door from the inside. Jake sat up straight, his face pale now. "What the hell was that?" We all fell silent, listening closely. Sure enough, we heard the distinct sound of the doorknob turning, followed by the eerie creak of the bathroom door. "All right, I'll check it out," Michael said bravely, grabbing his pillow as if it would serve as a weapon. "It's probably just some animal that got inside or something." Jake and I exchanged nervous glances, but followed him into the hallway, each holding our own pillows, as ridiculous as it seemed. The hallway stretched in front of us, dimly lit by the single bulb hanging overhead. At the far end, the bathroom door stood partially ajar, the light inside now flickering. The doorknob was rattling violently. Without warning, Michael let out a shout and rushed toward the bathroom door. "Enough of this crap," he yelled, his voice echoing through the cabin. As soon as he reached the door, the light inside the bathroom shut off, plunging the hallway into darkness. Michael froze. Jake quickly flicked the hallway light back on, and we all stared at the door, waiting for anything to happen. Michael slowly reached for the doorknob. "It's open," he said in disbelief. He pushed the door wide, and we all peered inside. The bathroom was completely empty. There was no way anyone could have left. The only window in the room was barred, and it was open just a crack. We were all silent for a moment, processing what had just happened. Then, trying to make sense of it, Jake spoke up, his voice shaky. We must be imagining things. Maybe the drinks messed with our heads. We tried to laugh it off, but deep down, we knew something was wrong. Michael, still holding on to his bravado, announced that he was going to use the bathroom first. Jake and I stood in the hallway waiting for him, the air growing thick with unease. That's when the lights went out. All of them. Complete darkness engulfed the cabin. Michael screamed from the bathroom, followed by Jake, yelling in terror. My heart pounded as a cold, eerie voice cut through the silence. "Die for me." The voice echoed through the cabin, neither distinctly male nor female, but low and broken, like it came from another realm. Panic surged through me. We fumbled for the light switches, desperately trying to turn them back on, but nothing worked. In the pitch-black darkness, the voice repeated, growing fainter but more sinister. "Die for me." We bolted. There was no way we were staying in that cabin another second. We ran out into the cold night, the distant roar of the ocean and the wind whipping through the trees our only company. Too scared to go back inside, we waited by the shore, shivering and confused until the first light of dawn crept over the horizon. When morning finally came, we hesitantly returned to the cabin, half expecting the worst. But inside, everything was as it had been. No signs of intruders, no strange noises, no broken lights. It was like the night had never happened. We left Briarcliff that morning and never returned. Whatever had haunted that cabin remains a mystery, but one thing is certain, we will never forget the terror we felt that night. The cursed heirloom. In our family, there are 3 cherished heirlooms. Though they may hold little value to others, they are sacred to us. The first is an ancient family tree, tracing our lineage over 4 centuries. The second is a katana, passed down from a long-dead ancestor, a gift from his feudal lord. And finally, there is an old, mysterious mirror. This story is about that mirror, an object that, if the legends are true, holds the power to curse anyone who dares remove it from our family estate. The family tree is kept on scrolls stored in finely crafted cedarwood boxes. Only the family patriarch is allowed to open it. The katana, though valuable, can never be sold and must be maintained by the head of the family monthly. The mirror, however, is the most peculiar. It's an antique polished metal, not glass, as one would expect. Roughly the size of a small plate, the mirror fits in your hand and is kept in the family shrine. The rules regarding the mirror are strict. It must never be removed from its box, and certainly not from the family estate. No matter the occasion, even the patriarch cannot remove it. This rule is law in our family. The mirror is heavy and hexagonal, with a rusted surface that barely reflects light anymore. Despite its flaws, it feels magical, imbued with something more than just history. I first encountered the mirror when I was a child. In elementary school, my friends and I had a treasure contest where we all brought something rare from home to show off at the park after school. While others brought toys, I proudly took the family mirror, thinking it would win me the competition. I warned my friends not to touch it, but of course, they didn't listen. My mirror won the contest, and I strutted home victorious. But that triumph was short-lived. When I returned home, I was greeted by my father's wrath. He wasn't furious about the mirror being damaged. It wasn't, but he was livid that I had taken it out at all. He lectured me for hours about the importance of the mirror, how it should never leave the house, and why it was dangerous. As a child, I didn't understand the gravity of it all. To me, it was just an old, rusty thing with no real reflection. Life moved on, and the mirror faded from my memory. That is, until I turned 20. I was attending university and living away from home when my father summoned me back to the family estate. I wasn't sure why, but I had a feeling it was important. When I arrived, my father brought me into the room with the family shrine and began explaining the significance of our heirlooms. He reiterated the rules about the family tree and katana, but lingered on the mirror. Our lineage goes back to the time of ancient rituals and curses, he said. He explained that many of the family heirlooms were once cursed objects, acquired through our ancestors' dealings with the supernatural. Most had been donated to museums or lost to time, but a few remained, chief among them, the mirror. My father told me the mirror wasn't just an heirloom, it was cursed. According to legend, the mirror had been taken out of the estate 3 times, and each time the person who removed it had met a disastrous fate. He said it was a death mirror, a mirror that showed the reflection of a person's death. This wasn't some family superstition. The curse had been taken seriously for the past 3 decades after a tragic event involving my grandmother. 30 years ago, my grandmother, who was once the matriarch of the family, died under mysterious circumstances. I had always been told it was an accident, but the details were sparse. My father's retelling painted a clearer, much darker picture. In the early 1980s, my grandmother didn't believe in the curse of the mirror. She would often show it to guests, laughing at the idea that something so old and battered could hold any real power. One summer during Obon, a festival honoring the spirits of ancestors, she decided to take the mirror with her to Osaka. It was a clear break in family tradition, but she insisted. As she packed her belongings for the trip, she took one last look at the mirror. For the first time, she saw something in its rusted surface, a dark, shadowy reflection of herself. Panicked, she rushed to compare her reflection in the bathroom mirror, but what she saw in the family mirror was entirely different. Her face in the heirloom was pitch black. My father told her it was just a trick of the light, or perhaps her imagination. Still, she insisted on taking the mirror to the family temple in Kyoto to have it purified. Against his better judgment, my father relented, allowing her to take it with her. He would later regret that decision deeply. On December 18, 1985, my grandmother boarded a flight from Haneda Airport to Osaka. The cursed mirror was with her. At precisely 6:04 p.m., the plane crashed. There were no survivors. My father believes the mirror caused the crash, that my grandmother's decision to take it off the estate triggered the curse. The mirror was recovered from the wreckage, completely unharmed. Since then, the family has kept it securely locked in the shrine, never to leave again. As my father finished the story, he placed the mirror on the table before me. "This is why we never remove it from its box," he said. "The curse is real, and it's dangerous." I could see the weight of his words in his eyes, the fear and respect he had for the ancient artifact. I didn't touch the mirror that day, nor have I touched it since. The mirror remains in our family shrine, a relic of the past that holds the power to destroy those who do not respect its curse. The house by the river. My grandparents on my mother's side lived in an old, sprawling house nestled by the banks of a slow-moving river in the town of Cedar Valley. The house, a relic of bygone days, had seen countless family gatherings, stories, and secrets over the years. With creaky floorboards and long, shadow-filled corridors, it was the perfect setting for childhood adventures and for things better left undiscovered. The house was so old that several sections had fallen into disrepair, including a detached guest house that hadn't been used in decades. My grandmother often warned me and my younger cousins to steer clear of the old structure, claiming it was too dangerous. "You kids stay away from there. The floorboards are rotten, and there's no telling what's in there," she'd say with a worried glance in its direction. This particular event took place when I was in 4th grade, during the summer holidays. Every summer, the entire extended family gathered at my grandparents' home to celebrate various festivals. This year, we were there for the Cedar Festival, a local tradition. Being the oldest of all the kids, I was tasked with keeping my cousins entertained while the adults gathered for their late-night conversations. After the ceremonial events ended, the sliding doors in the main hall were opened, and we all ate together, kids and adults alike. It was an annual tradition. As the adults settled into their evening party, the kids, myself included, found ourselves free to explore the house. This freedom often led to mischief. That evening, as the adults got louder with their drinks, one of my cousins, Leo, found an old flashlight in the hallway closet. The discovery sparked excitement. We began using it to cast shadows on the walls, and soon enough, we started talking about embarking on an adventure. Naturally, the forbidden guest house became our target. Despite all the warnings, I couldn't resist the idea of showing off my bravery. My cousins, Leo, Oliver, and my younger sister, Clara, were all eager to join but hesitant. As the eldest, I took charge. I whispered my plan to my father, who, tipsy from the evening's festivities, slurred, "Sure, just be careful." We crept down the hallway, the flashlight casting a thin beam of light ahead. Passing through the dimly lit kitchen and the old storeroom, we reached the back entrance where the glass door leading to the guest house stood. It was pitch black outside, and the beam of light barely penetrated the thick darkness beyond the door. When I opened the door, a rush of musty air greeted us. An old smell of wood, dust, and something else, damp. The hallway beyond was long and narrow, with creaky wooden floors and faded tatami mats. At the far end of the hall was a single wooden door. "I bet there's something cool behind that door," I said confidently, though in reality, my heart was racing. "Do we really have to go inside?" Clara asked, gripping my arm. "Yeah, I'll go first," I said, trying to hide my own fear. I turned to Leo, who was holding the flashlight. "Keep the light steady." Steeling myself, I took the lead. The wooden boards creaked ominously under my feet as I moved down the hallway. The smell of rot seemed to grow stronger with each step. I could hear my cousins whispering behind me, their voices a mix of excitement and fear. My hand hovered over the knob of the wooden door. "Here we go," I muttered, more to myself than anyone else. With a loud creak, the door opened. I stumbled forward slightly, and at that exact moment, a loud screech echoed through the dark. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest. The flashlight flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls. Then, from somewhere in the house, a cat meowed. I screamed silently, the sound trapped in my throat, and backed away from the door as fast as I could, nearly tripping over my own feet. Before I could even regain my balance, I saw my cousins bolting back down the hallway, leaving me behind in the dark. "Wait for me," I shouted, sprinting after them. As I ran, the door behind me slammed shut with an eerie finality. I didn't dare look back. We burst into the room where the adults were gathered, breathless and terrified. Leo and Clara were already there, huddled together and crying. My father gave me a stern look, despite his earlier indifference. "What happened? Why are you all scared?" one of the aunts asked, but no one could answer coherently. "There was a monster!" Leo yelled, still clutching the flashlight. The adults exchanged glances, and soon the evening's party was called to an end. As relatives left for the night, I managed to calm down a little, though the memory of that creaky door and the meow still lingered. Later, when I was alone with Clara, I asked her what she had seen. She hesitated before saying, "When you opened the door, I saw someone. There was a person standing in the room beyond, but you crawling back was scarier." Her words sent a chill down my spine. "A person?" I echoed. In the days that followed, I asked Leo and Oliver what they had seen. Their stories were wild and inconsistent. Leo swore a dog with glowing red eyes had chased us, while Oliver claimed he saw a ghostly woman stretching her neck toward us. None of their stories matched, but Clara's quiet insistence about the person behind the door stayed with me. Later that summer, my grandmother pulled me aside and whispered, "That old guest house has been empty for decades, but there was once a cat. A stray lived there for years, and it always meowed, until one day it just disappeared. Maybe it's still there, watching over the place." I never went back to the guest house, and I don't think I ever will, but sometimes, when I pass by it, I still hear that meow echoing in the night. Perhaps it wasn't just the cat. Perhaps, in the dark corners of that old house by the river, something, or someone, still lingers, waiting. The Lantern of Ebonvale. I heard this story when I visited my childhood home in the rural village of Ebonvale recently. It's a story that sent shivers down my spine, and I feel compelled to write it down. There's a long-standing custom in Ebonvale that, after visiting someone's grave, we walk back to the main house while carrying a lantern. It might sound like a simple ritual, but it comes with some very strict rules. Here are the conditions. The lantern flame must never go out. If it does, you must immediately return to the grave and relight it. You must not run. The youngest person present must carry the lantern. If the youngest is a baby or incapable, the next oldest person will carry it. Under no circumstances must you look at the Willow Shrine. The fourth rule always stuck out to me. The Willow Shrine is an old stone structure hidden in a small grove, set apart from the rice fields that dominate the landscape. It stands eerily alone along the path from the graveyard to the main house. The rule forbids anyone from glancing at it as they walk by. When I was young, I had the duty of carrying the lantern. My parents were firm in their instructions. This lantern helps guide our ancestors from their grave to the family altar. If the flame goes out, they'll get lost, they said. As a child, I thought it was strange, but followed their guidance without question. I vividly remember my mother covering my eyes when we approached the Willow Shrine. I giggled, thinking she was playing a game. When we passed, she uncovered my eyes and we safely reached home. The flame was transferred to a candle on the family altar, concluding the ritual. For years, I never thought much about the custom, but when I returned home recently, curiosity got the better of me. I asked my grandmother about the significance behind these rules, especially why it was so important not to look at the shrine. "Oh, we never told you the full story, did we?" she replied, her voice dropping as if she were about to reveal something forbidden. What she told me left me stunned. The flame must never go out because it's not just a light, it's a guide for the ancestors' spirit. Without it, they won't find their way home. You must not run because running attracts it. The youngest carries the lantern because they are closest to their ancestors' protection. The lantern shields them from it. And as for the Willow Shrine, you must never look at it because if you do, your ancestor will lose the power to protect you. Hearing her mention it multiple times made me nervous. "What is it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Grandmother's expression darkened. "We don't speak of it much. What it lives in the Willow Shrine." She explained that it was a creature that had lived in the shrine for as long as anyone could remember. It was said to resemble a grotesque figure with long limbs, somewhat like a monkey but far more sinister. Most of the year, it was dormant, but during the summer, around the Oban festival, it became dangerous. "It has a name," grandmother continued, "but we do not speak it. If you know its name, you'll be drawn to the shrine, and if you see it, there's nothing your ancestor can do to save you." I felt a chill crawl up my spine. As a child, I had never understood the danger my mother was shielding me from by covering my eyes. I silently thanked her for protecting me. But then, grandmother told me of a time when the ritual went wrong, when someone had broken one of the rules. "There was a year when the lantern's flame went out on the way back to the house," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "The person carrying it looked at the shrine. That year, someone in the family died by the next Oban. It always happens that way." I wanted to dismiss her story as superstition, but then she added, "You know Finn, don't you? He died last year. He was taken by it." Finn was my cousin. He died in a tragic accident last year. According to what I was told, he was driving along a straight road when, for no apparent reason, he swerved into the river and drowned. It had puzzled everyone. He was a careful driver, and the road was dry. Now, hearing grandmother's explanation, I felt a deep unease. "Last summer, the ritual failed," grandmother said, confirming my worst fears. "Little Ollie was the one carrying the lantern. He saw it." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Ollie, a relative's child, had been the lantern bearer. He had seen the creature in the shrine, and afterward, nothing could stop the disaster that followed. Despite attempts to purify him, Finn had died before the next Oban, just as the legend predicted. I left the house feeling unsettled. This tradition, which I had once seen as an innocent custom, now felt like something far more ominous. I couldn't help but worry. Had this year's ritual gone smoothly? The ceremony had already taken place before I arrived, but the shadow of dread lingered over me. Next year, I vowed to return to Ebonvale and participate in the ritual again. This time, I wouldn't treat it lightly. I'd ensure the lantern stayed lit and that no one, especially the youngest among us, looked at the Willow Shrine. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching, waiting for another chance to strike. As I left the village, I glanced back toward the rice fields, and for the briefest moment, I thought I saw a figure moving near the shrine, something long-limbed and shadowy. I quickly turned away, heart pounding, not daring to look back again. The Nightmare at Clearbrook Hill. It's been over 2 decades since that summer, but the memory still lingers in my mind. I was just a kid in elementary school, probably no older than 7 or 8. My family and I used to visit the countryside for the annual Harvest Festival, and that year we went to Clearbrook Hill, a small town where my grandparents lived. The fresh air, wide open fields, and towering hills were so different from the city. It felt like a dream. That year, my cousin Ethan, who was the same age as me, also came along with his family. We hadn't seen each other in a long time, and it was exciting to run around together again, with our bug-catching nets in hand. The countryside was a treasure trove of adventures, and before long, we found ourselves standing at the base of Clearbrook Hill, the mountain behind my grandparents' house. "There's gotta be some huge bugs up there," I said, my eyes gleaming with excitement. Ethan grinned. "What if they're too big to fit in the net?" We both laughed at the idea of mutant bugs, not really believing it, but our imaginations ran wild. The hills seemed to be teeming with life, buzzing and humming with insects we'd never seen before. We climbed up the trails, eagerly searching for our next big find. But just as we were getting into the fun, Ethan suddenly froze. I need to go to the bathroom," he said awkwardly. I chuckled. "You want to head back to the house?" Ethan shook his head, looking a little panicked. "No time, man. I gotta go now." He darted into some nearby bushes, crouching down with his pants around his ankles. I turned away, giving him some privacy, fiddling with the pockets of my shorts as I tried to find the tissues my mom had packed. I heard the unmistakable sound of relief behind me as Ethan did his business, but then without warning, a blood-curdling scream erupted from the bushes. I whipped around. "Ethan, what happened?" Ethan stumbled out of the bushes, his pants still only half up, and his face twisted in pure horror. His legs, from the knees down, were covered in writhing, dark red creatures. Leeches. Dozens of them. I'd never seen leeches before, having grown up in the city, but I knew what they were from stories my parents had told me. Still, nothing could have prepared me for seeing so many of them attached to my cousin's bare legs, sucking the life out of him. "Get them off me!" he screamed, swatting at his legs as he tried in vain to flick the leeches away. I panicked, pulling a tissue out of my pocket and thrusting it toward him, but Ethan was beyond reason. He wiped himself once, twice, then threw off his pants entirely. The leeches weren't just on his legs, they covered his feet, his ankles, and were even creeping up his thighs. He looked like some kind of monster from a nightmare, his lower half painted with red blotches where the leeches had latched on, sucking blood. "Help me!" he screamed again, his eyes wide with terror. I could barely think. Fear surged through me, and without another word, I turned and ran. I bolted down the mountain trail, heading straight for my grandparents' house, my heart hammering in my chest. I could hear Ethan behind me, still calling for help, but the sight of those leeches crawling all over him had completely broken my nerve. I thought if he caught me, I'd end up just like him, covered in blood-sucking monsters. "Mom! Dad!" I cried as I tore through the door to my grandparents' house, nearly tripping over the doorstep in my rush. As I kicked off my sandals, I looked down and screamed. My feet were covered in leeches too. Dozens of them clung to my toes and ankles, just like on Ethan. I was turning into a leech man, just like him. I ran through the hallway shouting for the adults, leaving a trail of tiny, bloody footprints behind me. My sandals were long forgotten, as I burst into the living room, where my aunt, uncle, and parents were sitting. My mom screamed when she saw me, but before I could even reach them, I heard more yelling from behind. Ethan had arrived. He was completely naked from the waist down, his legs drenched in blood and dotted with still more leeches. My aunt shrieked, covering her mouth in horror as my uncle rushed toward him. "Lighter! Get a lighter!" my uncle yelled, grabbing a match from the kitchen. My grandparents, who had heard all the commotion, hurried into the room, and within seconds, everyone was running around, trying to figure out how to help us. My uncle flicked the lighter near Ethan's legs, burning the leeches off one by one. The creatures shriveled and dropped to the floor as if they were melting. The adults stomped on them, crushing them into the hardwood floor. But even as they fell off, the blood didn't stop. Ethan's body was covered in smears of red, and the bleeding just wouldn't slow down. It was the same with my feet, even after my mom had carefully plucked off the leeches with a pair of tweezers. The blood kept flowing. We ended up at the hospital that night. The doctors told us that leeches secrete a chemical that prevents blood from clotting, which explained why we couldn't stop bleeding. I was patched up quickly, but Ethan had lost so much blood that they kept him overnight for observation. He lay in his hospital bed, wrapped in bandages like a mummy. "I'm sorry," I mumbled, feeling guilty for running away. Ethan gave me a weak smile. "Thanks for the tissue." As we left the hospital, I noticed two police officers talking with my grandfather. I didn't know who called them, but I overheard them talking about clearing the hill behind the house. The next day, the entire neighborhood came out with tools and sprayed chemicals all over Clearbrook Hill. The air was thick with the pungent smell of pesticides, but no one wanted to take chances with the leeches. Ethan stayed in the hospital for 2 weeks. They were worried about infections, but thankfully, he recovered. When we returned the following summer, neither of us felt like exploring the mountain again. Years later, after my grandfather passed, Ethan inherited the house at Clearbrook Hill. He still lives there, and oddly enough, he's become an expert on leeches. But whenever I visit, I can't help but feel like the number of leeches has somehow increased since Ethan moved in. And sometimes I wonder if he's really studying them, or something else entirely. The Forest of Echoes. About 10 years ago, I lived in a remote village deep in the mountains, a place where the nearest town was miles away. Our little home was nestled between thick forests and towering peaks. My family wasn't wealthy, and we weren't farmers by trade, but we kept a small plot of land, just enough to grow rice for ourselves. That tiny patch of field was our lifeline, but the real wilderness lay beyond. An endless expanse of dark woods that stretched to the very tops of the mountains. The village itself had no playgrounds or stores. Instead, the old temple grounds and the shadowy forest served as our playground. When my 2 younger brothers and I weren't at school, we'd spend our days playing among the trees, chasing each other in games of tag or hide and seek. As kids, we didn't think much about the legends that the older folks would tell. Tales of the spirits that roamed the woods, of creatures that could lead you astray and make you disappear forever. But one day, that all changed. It was a crisp autumn afternoon, and my brothers and I had just returned from school. We decided to take the familiar animal trail through the woods to the temple, as we had countless times before. The path was barely visible, just a narrow strip of earth winding through the dense trees. But we knew it well, using the sacred trees as our guideposts to navigate. These trees, marked with old, worn talismans, were said to ward off evil spirits. That day, the woods seemed quieter than usual. Still, we brushed it off as nothing more than the usual silence of the forest. We started a game of hide and seek. It was my turn to count. I turned to face one of the sacred trees, covered my eyes, and slowly began to count to 10. But as I counted, the usual sounds of the forest, the rustling of leaves, the chirping of birds, the buzzing of insects, suddenly vanished. It was as if the entire world had fallen silent. I paused, feeling a cold chill run down my spine. Something felt wrong. My voice trembled as I called out my brother's names, but there was no reply. I began searching, my heart pounding in my chest. I checked all the usual hiding spots behind the trees, under the rocks, but my brothers were nowhere to be found. A rising panic gripped me. They had never hidden this well before. I shouted again, "I can't find you, give me a hint." Silence. No clapping, no laughter, nothing but the eerie, oppressive quiet. Evening was approaching and the shadows in the forest seemed to lengthen unnaturally. I felt the urge to flee, to run back home and pretend none of this was happening. But my brothers, they'd never leave me alone like this. That thought alone kept me rooted in place. I tried retracing my steps, but as I walked, I realized something was horribly wrong. No matter how far I went, I kept seeing the same trees. Over and over, the same sacred trees loomed ahead of me, their talismans swaying gently in a wind I couldn't feel. Desperation clawed at me, and I began marking trees with a small stone. Yet when I circled back, the marks had vanished, like they'd never been there at all. I wandered for what felt like hours, but the sky never seemed to grow darker. It was as if time had frozen. I was trapped in a never-ending twilight, the only sound my own ragged breathing. Exhausted and terrified, I found myself drawn back to one of the sacred trees. I sat down at its base, clutching my knees to my chest, trying to calm the storm of fear rising inside me. Suddenly, there was a noise, a faint thud from the other side of the tree. My breath caught in my throat. It was the first sound I had heard that wasn't my own. Heart racing, I slowly rose and crept around the massive trunk of the tree. There, standing in the clearing, was a creature. At first, I thought it was a dog, but as I stepped closer, I realized it was something else. Its fur was a pale, yellowish color, almost glowing in the fading light. It was a fox, but far larger than any I had ever seen before. Its eyes locked onto mine, and for a brief moment, I felt paralyzed, unable to move. The creature didn't seem hostile, but there was something unsettling about it. It began to circle the sacred tree, its movements slow and deliberate. I watched, frozen, as it completed 3 slow laps around the tree. Then, without warning, it began to walk away, down the very path I had taken earlier. After a few steps, it stopped and turned to look back at me, its tail swishing slowly as if beckoning me to follow. I hesitated. Every instinct in my body screamed at me not to follow, to turn and run in the opposite direction. But something about the fox felt safe, familiar even, as if it knew the way out of this nightmare. I began to follow it, keeping my distance, but it never let me out of its sight. Every few steps, it would pause and glance back, ensuring I was still there. The further we walked, the darker the forest grew. The sacred trees disappeared, replaced by gnarled, twisted oaks that seemed to loom over me like silent sentinels. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we emerged from the woods. I blinked in the sudden light, realizing we had arrived at the temple grounds. My brothers and my mother were there, searching frantically. The moment they saw me, they ran over, hugging me tightly. I cried, overwhelmed with relief. When I turned to thank the fox, it was gone, disappeared without a trace. The next morning, the village elder told us that 5 foxes had been found dead in the forest near the sacred trees, their bodies mangled as if by some unseen force. They whispered about dark spirits and cursed places, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the fox, the one that had led me out, had saved me from something far worse. Even now, years later, I still remember those silent woods, the endless twilight, and the eerie presence of the fox. The forest hasn't changed, and every time I visit, I can't help but feel like it's watching, waiting. Just like it was that day.